Yeah, it's tough out here. Are you single, Mahesh?
I am single again.
Yeah, if you guys are looking for a DePIN king, we got two of them right here.
Yeah, unfortunately, Deepin still hasn't made it, so the budget is low for now.
We could take you to Applebee's, Cheesecake
Oh, I love
Factory.
that Applebee's. Anywhere that they take tokens.
Yeah,
Honestly, I might as well go dig up my Chuck E. Cheese tokens again. They might have some value in the next bull market if I figure out how to tokenize them. Sam, what's
Sorry
up,
about
dude?
hey Sam.
No, it's
How
all
you
good.
doing?
How's it going?
How are you doing? You're in New York, right, man?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. Did you move over here permanently, or are you just traveling back and forth?
Mostly traveling backwards and forwards still, but I guess technically my residency is here now. So yeah, rather
Gotcha.
than Berlin where I was before.
No, thank you so much for joining. So, with that, Sam, it's been a really interesting last year and a half. Obviously, crypto has had a tough time, but the world has also just gotten really, really weird. I pick up the newspaper every day. Some days I see aliens, sometimes I see superconductors. Do you have any thoughts on the world as it stands right now? And just generally, like, how has the last 2 years gone, and how do you see the next 2 years going?
Interesting. So I mean, I think this is an interesting segue to explain why we got started building Arweave in the first place. So we got started building Arweave. The first ideation happened in early 2017, just after Trump had been elected. Now, not, would you say, making any statements either side here, but what we were observing in the world was that the situation, the geopolitical situation was destabilizing. And the situation inside individual countries was also looking more and more unsettled. And so I guess I'd always been this kind of weird mixture of a student of computer science. I was doing a PhD in distributed operating system back then, distributed operating system design rather back then. And then also I had this very keen interest in politics, geopolitics, and I guess philosophy to some extent. And around this time, I started thinking about, okay, well, if the world is destabilizing, what are the useful things that we can actually practically do to try and do our bit to stop that going as badly as it could? And I'm a real fan of this philosophy that says that, like, you shouldn't look at the world and see all the terrible wrongs and think, okay, I'm going to go solve them all. Actually, you should just look at like one tiny slither that you are really best suited in the world to go solve. And so around this time, I was reading a book called The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, as well as Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which are both accounts of concentration camps, basically, in the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s. And a little bit later in the Gulag Archipelago too. And when you read those books, you see that, well, one thing that improves the quality of the world in general is having a clear view of the past so that we can make good quality decisions and have good quality conversations about what we should do in the future. This muddying and confusion about what has happened in the past is detrimental to society. So I'd been following Bitcoin, well, first BitTorrent, actually, funny enough, from the sort of mid-20, or the, what do we call them now, the noughties? I don't know what you call that era. Anyway, back then. And then I was following Bitcoin from the very early days, probably 2010, 2011. I don't know the date, but it was when Bitcoin was worth about 3 to 10 cents. I remember when it crossed parity with the dollar. That was a strange day. It's very confusing. Yes, but so I have this background in distributed systems. I saw that with Bitcoin, there was the kernel of an idea, which is basically on-chain history, right? So in the first block of Bitcoin, Satoshi embedded a Times headline, Chancellor on brink of second bailout of banks, right into the first block itself. You could argue Bitcoin has been used to store history longer than it has been used as a value transfer system.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so we thought, okay, well, there's a problem, big, wide problem, but with a sort of concrete, specific, would you say, solution or contribution we could make to a wider solution that we'll have to unfold. And, well placed to go address it. We understand distributed systems and their design configuration. let's go see if we can basically make on-chain storage at scale. And that's what we did with Arweave. In order to do that, we had to solve two fundamental problems, one technical and one economic. So the technical one is, okay, well, Satoshi may have put like 20 bytes or 30 bytes in that, in the Genesis block of Bitcoin, but how do we make it so that we can store like 30 terabytes in a block or 30 exabytes? Like, how do we make it so that we can store arbitrary amounts of data on chain? In order to do this, we built a series of consensus algorithms. Broadly in the family, I guess we would call succinct proofs of access or replication. They're actually kind of intertwined in some sense. Yes, but we made it basically so that you can add Merkleized data sets to the network in one go. And during the bear market last time, so we shipped Arweave in 2018 in June. And during the bear market last time, we spent most of our attention trying to make sure that it scaled correctly. Like Arweave V1, you could store, I think, up to 9 megabytes in a single transaction, something like that, which was enough to like play with the idea of what does on-chain history look like. There's a lot of great data from that era. But then in the bear market last time, we spent it making sure that you could put literally the entire web, all of the knowledge known to humans, inside a single base level transaction on Arweave without scalability problems. We do that through the system of bundling, which maybe we'll get into later. Well, the other problem you have to solve is, okay, now you can fit like arbitrary amounts of data on chain. You have an ever-growing ledger. You need a sensible way to pay for it. That's where we came up with the idea of a storage endowment. Simply put, you put data, when you put data into Arweave, you pay for 200 years worth of storage up front. As the cost of storage declines over time, 200 years expands out. Weirdly, if the cost of storage declines at a rate higher than 0.5% in a given year, given stable token price, then you end up with more storage purchasing power at the end than you had at the beginning. This is relatively similar to a traditional endowment that might be run by a university to pay for student tuition. The difference being that we look at the deflationary cost of the good that we're trying to buy rather than increasing the value of the portfolio. So essentially, we're holding value stable while the good that we're trying to buy gets cheaper. That's probably how it works.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's,
Makes a lot of sense. And no, I think this point about, forgetting, I always think about this point of we've forgotten more than we remember. Like time is so long and we are such a speck in like the ocean that is time at the end of the day. I always think about it through this framework of the three-body problem of like there are chaotic eras and stable eras. And it definitely feels like we're heading to a bit more of a chaotic era. So I think in the context of that, the idea of permaweb and permanent storage is really interesting, right? So I'd love to dig in a little bit about why you sort of chose the architectures that you did to begin with. And in particular, why did you decide to compete with a behemoth like Filecoin? Like that is a massive proposition.
This is very interesting because we don't see Filecoin as a behemoth. Actually, like if you look at true end users that are paying for storage, I'm pretty sure that Arweave has more end users that are actually, willing to pay for the storage that they're buying. Filecoin prints tokens to pay for the storage of users. And so you go to them and you say, hey, I'd like to store stuff. And they print tokens, so they dilute token holders in order to pay for that. As far as, like, we track this very, very closely because it really matters to our business. And as far as we can tell, and maybe Sami is one of the best placed people in the world to know about this, I would say. We haven't been able to find any true end users that are willing to pay for the service at all. Now, you compare that to Arweave, there are tons of them, like a huge number of different, sectors, subsectors of crypto and also outside of crypto. It's not massive volumes of data because Arweave is expensive. It's a risk model fundamentally. Permanent storage is endowment backed. You can make the endowment more aggressive, but you introduce risk. So Arweave is tuned to just be unbelievably reliable, transparent, and robust storage for long periods of time. Now, that means that it's relatively expensive. It's like 0.5 cent per megabyte, something like that. But there are huge numbers of real users of it. I think that there's, and to bring it back to Filecoin and the, let's say, Protocol Labs ecosystem, Filecoin was just an idea when we built and shipped Arweave. But they had this thing called IPFS before, which is the Interplanetary File System. Now, this is confusingly misunderstood, I think, as a data storage system. It is, in fact, a file system, as is in the name. Now, the difference between a file system and a data storage system is the difference between a hard drive and a pointer. The pointer will help you find the information on a disk. The hard drive stores the information for you. But even back then, they were calling IPFS the, quote, permanent web. You can look back on the Internet Archive. You can find when that was the tagline on their website. And we looked at this and we're like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe this solves our problem. But then we dug in and it's like, okay, by permanent, what they mean is that the hash doesn't change, which I find to be either insincere or just useless. How about both, perhaps? So it really wasn't solving the problem that we were setting out to solve. When we say permanent, we mean unchanging for the maximally achievable period of time. And it's a risk model. You can try and work out how long that actually is. But it really is incentivized for the longest period of time that we could engineer it to be so. And does so in transparent fashion, so you don't have to trust anyone. You can come and you can audit it. So it's a very different type of machine. And one final point I would say on that front is that there have been numerous times when the Filecoin team have tried to say that, it's okay, you can build a storage endowment basically on top of Filecoin. And we looked at this because building your own network is a non-trivial investment of time and resources. It'd be an awful lot easier if we could just buy it from a network underneath. But actually it just doesn't really make sense for number of reasons that we can get into if you want. But we weren't opposed to it at all. We thought that would be a pretty cool way to do things. We also don't like to compete with people that have seemingly similar ends. We'd much rather work together. But the reality, so we don't see it as a behemoth. Or I guess, how about this? Do you think Cardano is a behemoth? Because if Cardano is a behemoth, so is Filecoin. But when I look at the smart contract space, I see Ethereum, Solana. Maybe that's it. Those are the serious efforts.
No, I agree. And pulling on that thread of Filecoin as a competitor or not as a competitor. So earlier this year, we saw Filecoin launch their virtual machine, which basically enabled smart contracts and gave developers the ability to build out these perpetual storage applications. And one that we've seen emerge has been Lighthouse. And so it sounds like you don't consider these types of applications direct competitors to Arweave. Is that correct?
I think there will be direct competitors to Arweave over time. And they're most likely to try and compete on this cost of storage front because Arweave has extremely conservative parameters in the model so that you can be sure that the storage survives. But you could be more aggressive for sure. And I think that we've set up the governance system of Arweave so that people are actually incentivized to fork off the main chain and keep the data and keep the tokens and then dilute those tokens if they want to and create what we would call an evolution of the network. So I think that's where the competitors will come from. My understanding of Lighthouse is that it is essentially a DAO running it. Now, this is no different as far as I can tell from permanent.org, which is a nonprofit foundation. So you're trusting the board of managers of that foundation to manage the storage endowment over time. We think that that's, DAOs are interesting because they're programmable organizations, but arguably in some sense, which say normal world organization is programmable too, has some sort of constitution, article of associations, or whatever it happens to be in a given country or jurisdiction. But they are basically programmable. Now, they execute on-chain. That's cool. I actually think that that's a 10x improvement. And so when DAOs get accepted as forms of real companies that can be properly limited liability exempt and so on, then I think it will be a 10x improvement on what we have in the normal paper administrated world. But for this specific use case, which is, well, we want to put data into a system that perpetuates it for as long as feasibly possible. And how long is that? Well, we want to be able to not have to trust managers, human managers, which on the time spans that we're looking at don't exist yet. They haven't been born yet. So how do you know that you can trust them? Instead, we want to push that trust to mathematics, which is transparent and verifiable. And that's what Arweave focuses on doing. In the same way that Bitcoin is useful because it has a monetary policy where you don't have to trust a single individual or group to administrate it. You can trust the math. Arweave is the same thing, but applied to extremely long-term data storage.
And just continuing on that, you mentioned Bitcoin. I'm sure you've been following the recent developments with inscriptions and ordinals activity on Bitcoin, where, in the beginning, it was just being used for people to inscribe NFTs. Some people were minting meme coins on Bitcoin. However, I think the prevailing narrative here was this realization that Bitcoin could be used as some sort of storage layer for arbitrary data, right? And so what's your perspective here? I know that there really is no incentive mechanism for nodes. And so maybe in theory, it's not a good permanent data solution, but I'd be curious just to get your take on that.
Yeah, well, we love it. We are very glad to see this trend of on-chain storage scale, or on-chain storage demand scale, because Arweave is on-chain storage that is scalable at a supply level. So we're really happy about this. And you're absolutely right. It's quite an interesting idea. You can inscribe data into Bitcoin, but there's an incentive for miners to find ways to remove that data over time. Arweave is the opposite. You have an incentive to store the data because that's how the mining works, and the social consensus that that's how it always should work. In the Bitcoin ecosystem, you saw that ordinals were there was a big kerfuffle, to put it lightly, on crypto Twitter between some people that were of the opinion that Bitcoin is just for money, and so why do we have these pieces of data stored inside? And there are reasons that is a serious, or a statement that should be taken seriously, I think, which I can get to in a second. And there's the other people on the other side that were just excited that there's additional utility to the system. And you're absolutely right. Honestly, of all the things in the market right now, ordinals on Bitcoin are probably the closest competitor to Arweave. But Arweave is literally, not kidding, not being hyperbolous, 1 million times cheaper for storage. And also when you store data on Arweave, you have a strong, a strong protocolized claim to replication of that data. Whereas Bitcoin, people are incentivized to somehow farm that out. So you're not really clear how many replicas of the data set you're going to get. It's very interesting. I think one of the reasons that ordinals on Bitcoin do present a practical problem to the protocol itself is, well, what if someone embeds illicit content inside the chain of Bitcoin? Now, in Arweave, we have this content policy system, a decentralized content policy layer, where there's no individual or group that is in charge of the content policies, but miners are only paid to store, or miners are only paid for storing the data that they actually replicate, and they're not enforced to store anything. And so you get this auto-leveling effect to start with, where people are incentivized to replicate data, and incentivized to replicate data that's less well replicated too. But also they can comply with the laws of their land. They don't have to store anything that they don't want to, and indeed their moral consciences as well. Without a system like that, I don't know. Yeah, I think that could be a problem for Bitcoin long term. And don't get me wrong, I love Bitcoin. Actually, it's really one of the only crypto projects that I am truly a big fan of, and that's because it's properly decentralized protocol. It's done correctly. If Arweave is close in sort of philosophy to anything, is Bitcoin. We really believe that protocols should not be products. They should be immutable infrastructure that does one thing and that thing very, very well. And then the focus should be on growing the ecosystem on top of it, not changing the protocol as if it was a product all the time. Because if you do that, people can't depend on the protocol. And if you can't depend on the protocol, it may as well just be run by a company, and we can get rid of all this complexity from building in this extremely complex way, which is decentralization.
And I want to touch on one thing that you said before we dive a bit deeper into the actual Arweave ecosystem. So storing data on Bitcoin is quite expensive when you're comparing it to the cost of storing data on Arweave. However, if you compare the cost of storing data on Arweave to some of the other decentralized storage networks like Storj, Filecoin, Arweave actually looks significantly more expensive. And so I'm curious, when you look at what type of data is best suited for the Arweave network, are you thinking it's more what kind of data fits? Because I'm assuming the network is better suited for megabytes or gigabytes worth of data. We're not talking terabytes, because storing 1 terabyte of data costs around $6,000. And so how do you think about, what type of data is going to end up getting stored on Arweave?
Yeah, so I think the most sensible frame to understand this from is that when you buy storage on Arweave, it's like you're buying a house versus renting a house. Like you can rent storage for your data, which is what you do on I think pretty much all of the other decentralized storage networks, or you can buy storage and you make a one-time commitment to the endowment. And yes, it is expensive, but also if it were cheap, it wouldn't work. So, two sides of the coin. Yeah, it's just a very, very different type of product. And I think that you're right. That means that a different type of data is what you want to store inside of it. You want to store high value data, stuff that you really care about. And we sort of boiled this down to a metric we call information value density. Right? So there are certain types of information, for example, a blog post or your family images that you care about, photos. Well, these things would be great uses of Arweave. They are relatively small in size, but very, very high value for you. Well, Arweave is a perfect use case. Whereas perhaps like 4K video of security cameras overnight, yeah, you probably store that somewhere else. Like you don't need that information that much. So the information value density is way lower. But we sort of see this playing into the long-term vision for Arweave, which we don't normally talk about because it's so far off, but we see that basically eventually Arweave probably becomes information gold. It competes with Bitcoin. And the articulation is relatively simple. Arweave is this massive archive, a modern Library of Alexandria of all of the most important information that humans have decided that they want to replicate over a long period of time, associated with a constrained token supply that in fact actually deflates generally when people use the network, versus Bitcoin, which is just a digital scarcity, full stop. And I personally think that over a long period of time, people are probably likely to gravitate to the network that actually is filled with valuable data and information and records of history. Like if you look back now at 2019, for example, there are records, about 700,000 primary source records of how Hong Kong fell and was, let's just put it this way, the national security law was enacted in Hong Kong, which normalized some relations with the mainland that were previously sort of more separated. I think it's about the level that we want to discuss it at. But the record of that event in history is stored inside the system. You can look back at that bit of history of humanity's experience and you can see it in high fidelity. And it's never going away. So we think that that's extremely powerful. You look back at the beginning of the, say, second phase of the Russia-Ukraine war, right? Early February 2022, where there's 75 million pieces of information, primary source information that was stored at the time that was happening, the escalation was unfolding, into the Arweave network. And that's buried now under massive amounts of proof of work that make it practically impossible that anyone could try and create a competing record of history. I don't know if you, and this happens in Arweave all the time. And maybe if we want to talk about the ecosystem on top of Arweave, yes, one of the interesting things that's being built at the moment is a system called Alex for Alexandria, which is essentially a way for the community to subsidize uploads of historically valuable pieces of information, and then essentially have them as, you could say, have them present in a personal museum that they can then organize and display to people and create a story out of in some sense. As well as other things. For example, you mentioned UFOs at the beginning there. Well, there's actually a UFO pool on Alex. So if you contribute to the UFO pool, you get tradable NFTs that are records of history of the UFO story that is currently unfolding in society. Now, of course, it's situation dependent whether it's appropriate that those things be tradable, but they can be if it's low. I was about to say it's low seriousness, but you can hardly say that if there are actually aliens, it's low seriousness. Anyway, people's approach to it is low seriousness. But yeah, so there's a ton of things like that being built on top of the system that move in this direction as well of a massive communal archive of all of humanity's important knowledge. And I think eventually the tokens associated with that probably do compete with Bitcoin, but it's so far off. This is my first time mentioning it in public for like 4 years, I think. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so you mentioned one application, Alex, that's using Arweave for permanent storage. What other applications are out there? I was looking at the dashboard recently, and it looks like Arweave actually reached a new milestone in the number of transactions last week. And so I'm curious, what categories of applications are driving the majority of this transaction activity?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to, we tweeted out that there was a weekly all-time high in transaction counts on Arweave. But what's funny is actually that was 2 weeks ago. Last week was also another all-time high. But to be honest, like after a while, it's the same story every week. So, or not every week, but a good number of the weeks. So we don't mention it all the time. But yes, usage of the network is really increasing. And that's exciting because we saw the first strong product market fit with Arweave for storing, funny enough, NFTs, just monkey pictures to begin with. Because people have data that they ascribe high value to, well, where better to put it than the permanent information storage system. And that was a massive wave, a massive influx of traffic. I was looking earlier actually at some of the records on the graphs of that period, and I think there was 1 month where we got 30x the amount of usage of the network in a single month, which was really crazy. And
wow.
It was because we focused on making the system, complete and scalable in the bear market, that when the bull market came along, we were in the right position. But nowadays, the uses of the system have radically diversified. That's something that I see as a very, very strong indicator. So I guess that there's two very broad buckets. One is content that other people want to use somehow. That's kind of like the evolution of where NFTs go. And some of the subsections inside there are things like decentralized social. So Lens is now using Arweave as a backbone for its decentralized social system. Same with CyberConnect. I think CyberConnect pushed 70 or 80 million pieces of information in the last year to Arweave, something like that. It's really pretty serious quantities. And then there's this other batch that you could call like Arweave as infrastructure. And the simplest way to explain this is, or to technical people, let's say, is Arweave is a gossip network that never forgets. So what this means is that you can write data into it, and then you can sync back that data later and get a reproducible state out the end of it. And one of the things, this is useful for a ton of things. It kind of fits into the modular blockchain thesis, if you like. But one of the subcategories that's gaining a lot of traction at the moment, and I think, Sami, you wrote about this at one point, is the use of Arweave as a backend for decentralized databases. Like a good number really, like if there is a place that decentralized databases are being built, which isn't their own chains and network, it's on top of Arweave. And so we've seen a bunch of that this year. Another good use of the system is oracles. So there are scalable Oracle networks that are using Arweave as the big data lake to publish their data points to, and then people can pull those data points into other chains on demand when they need to use that price to achieve some end inside a smart contract. Yeah, there's a ton more, but what we're seeing is this wide diversification of the uses, which is really encouraging, I think.
Really interesting take. I love the Alexandria comp, to be honest. Like I'm a history buff at the end of the day. And again, it just keeps going back to this point of like, we've forgotten as much as we remember, probably a lot more. So makes sense here.
Yeah, we've forgotten we've forgotten and also we've manipulated the rest too. I mean, our current perception of the past is virtually nothing like the people that lived through it would have experienced it as. There are so many examples of this, and a lot of them are relatively controversial, but it is everywhere if you just dig in. And so I totally agree.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like an evolution of humanity and how humanity remembers. But, any evolution of humanity, it's a big undertaking. It's an undertaking that at the end of the day is hairy, is maybe not linear. How do you start driving changes in user behavior to start driving people more to Arweave, to decentralized solutions? Because, We are massive bulls on DePIN, on crypto as a whole, but we got to start getting people using this stuff at scale more. So, would love to hear your perspective on like how do we really drive that user behavior?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So we think that it's all about incentives, basically. And so when we discussed Alex, a moment ago, why do we encourage the building of Alex? Well, because we wanted to create the correct incentives for people to replicate important information. And now you can, let's take the UFO pool as an example. You contribute tokens to this, and you get these little artifacts of history. They're small nuggets, but they are very real. They are the first recording of, the first archiving of information about, I don't know, David Grush or whatever it happens to be, the whistleblower that came forward recently. Supposed whistleblower. Yes.
Whistleblower.
Well, I mean, that's a stretched term nowadays, I guess. But anyway, yes, you can get that figment of history, that little artifact, and you can trade it with people that find it interesting. And so that's an attempt to create the incentives that get people to want to archive stuff. Now, on the other side, on let's say the content side, we see that it's all down to creator monetization, essentially. We think that decentralized social will flourish because it will allow people to create a more efficient market for content long term, where previously creators had to go to, say, YouTube or X, and they are essentially beholden to the platform, and the platform is incentivized to take as much value as they possibly can to from this captive audience. And we've seen good examples recently of just how serious these network effects are. They're very, very difficult to break. When like 120 million people approximately joined Threads in like a week, it wasn't sufficient to break the network effects of Twitter. Yeah. So we think that the way that you do compete with those old systems is you offer people better ways to monetize. And we think that this can work. This can be a win-win situation. We think that what you can do is essentially allow people to license data when they upload it, and then developers can make use of it if they want to. So we flip the book and we say creators can upload their data not to a website, but to the web on Arweave, the permaweb. And when they do so, they can atomically associate that data with license terms. So when you upload data to Arweave, because it's structured like an archive, it's not just the data, which is a sort of content identifier, which we think is a crazy idea, by the way, but maybe we can cover that later. Not just a content identifier, but a provenance identifier, which is the data, the metadata, and a signature, right? All of this together, a hash of that says, okay, that's the item of data that can be moved around. And in Arweave's case, you can even put a contract inside that piece of data. And so what you can do with this altogether is when you're a creator and you upload something, you can say, okay, I'm going to attach a license to this data that can't be removed. You can't separate the data from the license. They come as one. And the license is going to say, you can access my data, but if you want to make use of it commercially, you have to pay this license fee. Now, you can pay the license fee just to the creator, but you could also pay the license fee to the owners of the token embedded inside the piece of data itself. We call these atomic assets. And when you have a system like this, a developer can come along, and instead of having to essentially spend a weekend building the TikTok UI and 10 years competing with YouTube to get it adopted, you can just build the UI and you build on top of the data set, and then you pay people proportionate to the usage that you make of their data. And from the creator's point of view, they are now sovereign, right? Their identity cannot be taken away from them. And now they are dictating terms to the platforms, not the other way around. And a bunch of other benefits. They can trade the royalty stream of their data when they upload it. It's just like an obvious financial efficiency. And so we think basically making Arweave the best place to publish, which is what Forward Research, the company, so we didn't even mention this, but basically I run a company called Forward Research. We're sort of an offshoot from the organization that started Arweave in the first place. I founded the network, but I'm not the leader of it. It's very much a properly decentralized ecosystem at this point. There are about 7 other institutions that are all just focused on making Arweave, driving Arweave adoption. But our view of the world is that making Arweave the best place to publish is how we attract people to upload to it. And then when they upload, of course, we get our archive of humanity's culture and knowledge and history for free. And so that's how we see the broad strategy.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense here. And I think when we sort of see the world as of today and the world as it will be in the future, it really goes back to this point about user ownership, getting people paid for the work they actually do, and the tracking of information all across the internet and the world. And totally see how Arweave is so core to all of that, and how the design choices of what you're thinking about here are very different than most of the other projects in the market as of today. What are you most excited about when you sort of look out again over the next couple of years? We've had a pretty tough bear market. Feels like there's some green shoots emerging. Feels like people are starting to get excited about the space again. What really gets you really excited in the morning?
Huh. Um, Honestly, I see what we're working on is a very, very long process of achieving that original goal that we set out to, which is this like permanent archive of humanity's knowledge and history, a permanent collective memory, I guess you could say. But getting there is a very long process. I'm assuming that I will personally be working on this for another 15 years or something. And after that, there will be many more people for much, much longer. It's really a very long-term project. But in the next 2 years or so, I think it comes down to that question of making composable data a real, you could say, product. It's not really a product, but experience, a set of tools that create an experience together. And we really see the base level of that is now complete. There's the open data lake, that's Arweave. There's a mechanism for licensing your content inside of it. That's the universal data license. It's a system that is essentially a programmable license that is human enforceable, if that makes sense. You can take it to a court and say, hey, look, they broke my license agreement, but you can, as a developer, instead of speaking to a lawyer, you just read the wiki page and you say, okay, I'll add this tag that says that tag that says that. So very, very easy for developers to use, and even easy for creators to understand what the license is doing. So there's that component. Then there's SmartWeave and the smart contracting systems on top of Arweave that allow you to embed contracts inside data themselves inseparably. And then we're now seeing the first major applications that are starting to adopt this. And unfortunately, I don't know when this is going to go out, but I think it's probably best
Three
I don't
weeks,
mention
2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, okay, that's all right. We'll leave it. But yes, we got some really exciting things coming down the pipe with that.
Come on, give it to us.
No,
Give it
no,
to
no,
us.
no,
We'll
no,
delay.
no.
We'll delay putting it out if we need
It's
to.
okay.
We love
okay.
an inside scoop.
I'll come back.
Okay.
How about that?
Okay, fair enough. We're counting on that. Well, look, Sam, with that, this has been an awesome hour that we've spent here. We've continued to appreciate getting to know you here. The project is obviously one that has not only a lot of attention, but has a lot of really smart people really excited about it. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what continues to get us excited about the project, about the space as a whole, is there's still so many smart people building here. There's still so many smart people innovating here. And at the end of the day, that's really what's going to drive the incredible outcomes. Last thing, maybe we could tell our audience just where to find you if they want to learn more, kind of where to look.
Yeah, so I'm Sam E.C. Williams on Twitter, and there you can find a way to Weave mail me and find me on the Weave and all my content there.
Awesome. Well, with that, guys, thank you so much for the time here, Sam. And this was an awesome one, and we're super excited to continuing to see you grow here.